The day I turned 18 wasn't marked by a birthday cake or a celebration, but by the screeching tires of a matte black Mercedes pulling into the gravel driveway of St. Jude's Home for Boys. For 15 years, my so-called family had pretended I didn't exist, perfectly content to let me rot in the foster system after my parents died in a tragic accident. Yet, here they were, dressed in designer morning clothes, flanked by a nervous lawyer clutching a heavy leather briefcase. My grandfather, Arthur Pendleton, was dead. And the vultures had come to the orphanage not to collect me, but to strip me to the bone. Because, as I was about to find out, the old man had just left me his entire empire. St. Jude's Home for Boys in upstate New York was the kind of place that seeped into your bones. It smelled perpetually of industrial bleach, boiled cabbage, and damp brick. I had spent 15 years of my life within those peeling walls, ever since I was 3 years old. My name is Oliver Pendleton, though for most of my life, I was just Ward 42. My parents, David and Sarah Pendleton, died in a horrific pileup on the interstate during a blizzard. That was the official story anyway. The state took custody of me because, according to the social workers, no next of kin stepped forward. I grew up believing I was entirely alone in the world, an unwanted anomaly. I learned to fight for extra rations in the cafeteria, to hide my meager belongings under the loose floorboard beneath my cot, and to expect absolutely nothing from adults. It was a freezing Tuesday morning in late November when my reality fractured. I was in the basement, my hands covered in grease, trying to coax some life out of the ancient boiler that rattled like a dying beast. The heavy metal door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and Mrs. Higgins, the orphanage director, called down. Her voice, usually a sharp bark, was trembling. "Oliver, wash your hands. Come to my office immediately." I wiped the grease onto a rag, a pit forming in my stomach. Usually, a summons to the director's office meant someone was in trouble, or worse, a transfer to a juvenile facility. But I had kept my head down lately. I trudged up the stairs, my boots leaving faint black smudges on the linoleum. When I opened the door to Mrs. Higgins's office, the air practically hummed with tension. The tiny, cramped room, usually smelling of cheap instant coffee and old paper, was overwhelmed by the scent of expensive Tom Ford cologne and heavy, floral perfume. 3 strangers occupied the space. 2 of them sat in the uncomfortable wooden chairs meant for misbehaving orphans. The third stood by the frosted window, looking out at the barren courtyard with an expression of profound disgust. "Oliver," Mrs. Higgins squeaked, shrinking behind her desk. "These people are here for you." The woman sitting nearest to the door turned around. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored black wool coat that probably cost more than the orphanage's annual operating budget. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back into a severe chignon, and her eyes, a striking, icy blue, locked onto me with a mixture of horror and deep resentment. This was Beatrice Pendleton Smythe. Next to her sat a man who looked like he had been poured into his custom-made Italian suit. He had a flushed face, thinning hair, and was aggressively checking a gold Patek Philippe watch. Richard Pendleton. The man by the window finally turned. He was older, wearing a modest but sharp charcoal suit, clutching a thick leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. "You must be Oliver," the older man said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He stepped forward, ignoring the grime on my clothes, and extended a hand. "My name is Gregory Wallace, of Wallace, Sterling, and Croft. I was your grandfather's personal attorney." I stared at his hand, then up at his face. "My grandfather?" I rasped, my voice thick with disuse. "My grandfather is dead. My parents said he died before I was born." Beatrice let out a sharp, cruel laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "Oh, David always was a dramatic liar. Father didn't die, you filthy little urchin. He just cut your father off for marrying that waitress." "Beatrice, please," Gregory Wallace warned, his tone dropping an octave. He turned back to me. "Oliver, your grandfather, Arthur Pendleton, passed away 4 days ago at his estate in Connecticut. He was 82 years old." I stood there, frozen. A grandfather. I had a grandfather this whole time? A man with estates and lawyers? While I was getting into fistfights over a stolen blanket in a state-run facility? The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. "If he's dead," I said, my voice hardening, the street-smart kid taking over the scared orphan, "why are you here? Why didn't you leave me wherever you've left me for the last 15 years? Trust me, boy, if it were up to us, we wouldn't have crossed the state line into this miserable wasteland, Richard snapped, finally looking up from his watch. But Father's will had a very specific, heavily notarized stipulation. It had to be read on your 18th birthday, which is today. And it had to be read in your presence, wherever you resided. I looked at the calendar on Mrs. Higgins's wall. It was indeed my 18th birthday. I had forgotten. So read it, I said, leaning against the doorframe, crossing my arms over my greasy overalls. Read it and get out. Gregory Wallace nodded solemnly. He placed his briefcase on Mrs. Higgins's cluttered desk, unlatched it, and pulled out a thick stack of ivory, watermarked paper, bound in a blue legal folder. He adjusted his half-moon glasses and cleared his throat. This is the last will and testament of Arthur Pendleton, dated October 14th of this year. Gregory began, his voice taking on a formal, practiced cadence. I, Arthur Pendleton, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all former wills and codicils made by me. He droned through the legalese for what felt like an eternity. I watched Beatrice and Richard. They were practically vibrating with anticipation. They looked like starving wolves waiting for a piece of meat to drop. To my daughter, Beatrice Pendleton Smythe, Gregory read, and Beatrice immediately sat up straighter, adjusting the collar of her coat. I leave the sum of $5 million, placed into a heavily restricted trust, to be dispersed in monthly increments of $10,000. I also leave her the summer cottage in Martha's Vineyard, provided she never attempts to sell it. Beatrice's face strained of color. $5 million, she whispered, the words choking in her throat. A trust? A restricted trust? He's treating me like a child. The estate is worth billions. Beatrice, contain yourself, Richard hissed, though his own forehead was shining with nervous sweat. Read mine. Wallace. Gregory didn't even look up. To my son, Richard Pendleton, I leave my collection of vintage automobiles, currently housed in the Monaco facility. Furthermore, I leave him a one-time cash sum of $3 million, which I estimate will cover his outstanding gambling debts for exactly 1 calendar year if he continues his current pathetic trajectory. Richard leaped from his chair, his face turning a dangerous, mottled purple. That senile old bastard! He can't do this! I am the executive vice president of Pendleton Logistics! I built the European division. You nearly bankrupted the European division, Richard, Gregory said mildly, finally looking up over his glasses. Arthur was well aware of your offshore accounts. We will contest this, Beatrice shrieked, slamming her manicured hands onto Mrs. Higgins's desk, causing the poor director to flinch violently. We will have him declared incompetent. He had dementia. He must have. Arthur was evaluated by 3 independent, board-certified psychiatrists the day this will was signed. Gregory replied, his voice a cool whip cracking through the room's chaotic air. He was sharper than both of you combined until the day his heart stopped. Now, if you would allow me to finish. Silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. Beatrice and Richard glared at the lawyer, their chests heaving. I remained glued to the doorframe, a surreal sense of detachment washing over me. They were fighting over millions like it was pocket change. Gregory turned the page. He looked directly at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of profound sympathy in his eyes. As for the remainder of my estate, Gregory read, his voice echoing in the small room, including my controlling shares in Pendleton Logistics, the estate in Connecticut, the penthouse in Manhattan, and all liquid assets, offshore accounts, and intellectual properties held under the Pendleton umbrella. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. I leave entirely and without condition to my grandson, Oliver Pendleton. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a devastating explosion. My brain short-circuited. I didn't know how much the remainder of the estate was, but judging by the sudden, terrifying lack of oxygen in the room, it was astronomical. No, Beatrice breathed out, her voice a fragile, broken thing. No, no, no. That is impossible. He is a nobody. He's a street rat. He's a minor, Richard yelled, spit flying from his lips. He can't legally inherit. He turned 18 today, Richard, Gregory said calmly. As per Arthur's exact calculations. Richard lunged. He moved with a speed I didn't expect from a man his size, bypassing the desk and coming straight for me. His hands, thick and heavy with gold rings, reached for my collar. You little piece of trash. What did you do? How did you manipulate him? My survival instincts, honed by 15 years in a brutal system, kicked in instantly. I ducked under his grasping hands, pivoted, and shoved him hard against the filing cabinet. It dented with a loud, metallic bang. "Don't touch me," I growled, my voice low and dangerous. "Richard, back away immediately!" Gregory shouted, finally losing his composure. He pulled a thick document from his briefcase. Before Arthur passed, he anticipated this exact reaction. "I have here a preemptive restraining order, signed by a federal judge, barring both of you from coming within 500 feet of Oliver. If you so much as breathe in his direction again, you will be arrested, and your trusts will be rendered entirely void by a violation clause." Richard froze, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it made my skin crawl. Beatrice was sobbing now. Ugly, jagged sounds, ruining her expensive makeup. "You haven't seen the last of us," Richard spat, straightening his ruined suit jacket. "You won't survive a week in our world, boy. We will tear you apart." "Get out," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the violent trembling in my hands. They left, the slam of the heavy orphanage door echoing down the sterile hallways. Mrs. Higgins looked like she might faint. I stood in the center of the room, the smell of grease still on my hands, suddenly a billionaire. Gregory Wallace sighed deeply, packing his papers back into his briefcase. He walked over to me and pulled a small, sealed envelope from his inner jacket pocket. The thick parchment bore a heavy wax seal stamped with an ornate P. "He told me to give this to you as soon as the reading was over," Gregory said quietly, pressing it into my dirty hands. "Your grandfather made many mistakes, Oliver. Leaving you here was one of them. But there is a reason for everything that happened. Read it. My car is waiting out front whenever you are ready to leave this place forever." I looked down at the wax seal. My hands were shaking. I broke it open, pulled out the single sheet of paper, and read the elegant, sprawling cursive. "Oliver, if you are reading this, I am dead and the wolves are already at your door. Forgive me for the hell I let you endure. It was the only way to keep you hidden. They murdered your father, Oliver, and if they knew who you truly were, they would have murdered you too. Come home, we have work to do. Arthur." The ride from St. Jude's to Connecticut was a blur of high-speed asphalt and deafening silence. Gregory Wallace's car wasn't just a car, it was a custom, bulletproof Maybach that glided over the highway like a ghost. I sat in the back, the buttery leather, a stark contrast to the coarse, itching wool of my orphanage-issued sweater. I kept my hand curled tightly around my grandfather's letter inside my pocket, the wax seal crumbling against my fingertips. "They murdered your father, Oliver." The words played on a loop in my mind. For 15 years, the state told me my parents died because of black ice. An accident, a tragedy, but the billionaire who had orchestrated my entire miserable existence from the shadows was telling me it was a hit, and the people responsible had just been sitting in Mrs. Higgins' office, complaining about trust funds. "Mr. Wallace," I finally spoke, my voice cracking the quiet of the cabin. "Gregory, please, Oliver," the lawyer replied from the front passenger seat, turning slightly to look at me through the partition window. "Gregory, if my grandfather knew Richard and Beatrice killed my parents, why didn't he go to the police? Why leave me in a place like St. Jude's?" Gregory sighed heavily, removing his half-moon glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. "Arthur was a titan, Oliver, but he was also a man trapped by his own empire. The evidence regarding your parents' car crash was circumstantial. Sabotaged brake lines on your father's Volvo. But the trail was scrubbed clean. Arthur knew his children were involved, Richard had the motive, Beatrice had the connections, but he couldn't prove it in a court of law. If he brought you into the family, into this house, you would have been an obstacle. You would have had a target on your back from the day you learned to walk. So he let me starve," I said bitterly. "He let me get beaten half to death by older kids just to keep me off the radar. He kept you alive," Gregory corrected softly. "He monitored you. The anonymous donations that kept St. Jude's from closing its doors? That was Arthur. The reason the state never transferred you to a maximum security juvenile facility after you broke that older boy's jaw at 14? Arthur's legal team quietly intervened. He couldn't give you luxury, Oliver, but he gave you a pulse, and he gave you time to grow hard enough to survive what comes next." Before I could respond, the Maybach slowed. We turned off a winding, tree-lined road in Greenwich, Connecticut, and approached a set of massive wrought iron gates. Cameras tracked our movement. The gates swung open seamlessly, revealing a sprawling, 3-story stone manor that looked like it had been violently ripped from the English countryside and dropped into New England. As we pulled up to the circular driveway, a man was waiting on the front steps. He was built like a cinder block, wearing a tactical black suit with an earpiece curled around his ear. His nose looked like it had been broken and reset half a dozen times. "Oliver, this is Thomas Gable," Gregory introduced as we stepped out into the freezing wind. "He is the head of your personal security detail. He answers exclusively to you." Gable didn't smile. He looked me up and down, taking in my grease-stained overalls and scuffed boots. "You don't look like a billionaire, kid." "You don't look like a butler," I shot back, my defensive instincts flaring. A corner of Gable's mouth twitched upward. "Good. You've got teeth. You're gonna need them. We swept the perimeter an hour ago, Mr. Wallace. Everything is clear, but I've doubled the guard rotation. If Richard and Beatrice are stupid enough to make a move tonight, they won't make it past the tree line." The inside of the mansion was suffocatingly grand. Vaulted ceilings, dark mahogany panels, and priceless oil paintings of people I didn't know. A quiet, older woman named Clara Hughes introduced herself as the head housekeeper, practically forcing a bowl of hot, gourmet stew into my hands before ushering me to the master wing. Arthur's study was on the second floor, a massive room smelling of old paper and expensive scotch. Gable left me at the door, taking up a post in the hallway. I walked behind the massive oak desk and sat in the heavy leather chair. The reality of my situation was crushing. I wasn't just wealthy. I was the king of a hill, surrounded by predators. My eyes fell on a brass puzzle box sitting perfectly centered on the desk. Tucked underneath it was a small, handwritten note. "To open the future, use the day your life ended." I stared at the box. The day my life ended. I rotated the dials on the side of the box. 112611. The 26th of November 2011. The date of the car crash. The box clicked loudly, the top springing open. Inside rested a single, heavy brass key and a black flash drive. I plugged the drive into Arthur's laptop. The screen flickered to life, requiring a password. I typed in the date again. Access granted. Folders filled the screen, thousands of documents, bank transfers, photographs, audio recordings. I clicked on a folder labeled European Division, Richard. The first document I opened was a forensic accounting report detailing how Richard had embezzled nearly $60 million through shell companies in Cyprus. I clicked another folder, Beatrice, the Vineyard Incident. I sat in that chair until the sun came up, reading every single sin my family had committed. Arthur hadn't just left me an empire, he had left me an arsenal, and it was time to go to war. The transformation took exactly 3 hours. The next morning, a tailor from Manhattan was brought in via helicopter. He measured me, pinned me, and forced me into a bespoke, midnight blue suit that cost more than St. Jude's annual heating bill. Clara had ordered a barber who shaved my unkempt scruff and styled my hair, stripping away the grease and grime of the orphanage. When I looked in the antique mirror in the master bedroom, the street rat was gone. Staring back at me was a cold, sharp-edged air. I looked eerily like the portrait of Arthur hanging in the grand foyer. "The chopper is fueled, boss," Gable said, stepping into the room. He looked me over, nodding once in approval. "Gregory is waiting on the tarmac. The board meeting starts at 10. "Do they know I'm coming?" I asked, adjusting my cuffs. "No," Gable grinned, a dangerous, wolfish expression. "Richard called an emergency session of the board of directors. He's planning to have himself voted in as interim CEO, citing your unfit mental state and lack of corporate experience." "Let him try," I murmured. The helicopter ride from Greenwich to the helipad on top of the Pendleton Logistics Tower in Lower Manhattan took less than 20 minutes. The skyline of the city rushed up to meet us, a forest of glass and steel. As we stepped off the chopper, the freezing wind whipping around us, Gregory handed me a thick leather portfolio. "Everything you requested from the flash drive has been printed and notarized," Gregory yelled over the roar of the rotors. "Are you ready for this, Oliver? Once you walk through those doors, there is no going back. You are declaring open hostility." They declared hostility the day they cut my father's brake lines. I replied coldly, walking toward the roof access doors. Gable and 2 other heavily armed security men flanked us. We took the private executive elevator down to the 60th floor. As the silver doors slid open, we stepped into a sprawling lobby of Italian marble and frosted glass. An executive assistant dropped her tablet when she saw us, her jaw hanging open, We ignored her, walking straight for the massive double doors of the main boardroom. Through the frosted glass, I could hear Richard's booming voice. And while it is a tragedy that my father's mind degraded so significantly in his final weeks, we cannot allow a legally unverified, uneducated juvenile to take the helm of a multinational logistics firm. The shareholders are panicking. I motioned for an immediate vote of no confidence in the execution of the will and formally nominate myself for the position of. Gable didn't bother knocking. He shoved the heavy oak doors open with enough force that they slammed against the interior walls, cracking the plaster. The boardroom went dead silent. 15 men and women in expensive suits snapped their heads toward the entrance. Beatrice was sitting at the right side of the table, looking incredibly smug. Richard was standing at the head of the long glass table, mid-speech, his face freezing in an expression of absolute horror. I walked into the room, my footsteps echoing loudly on the hardwood floor. Gregory walked a pace behind me, his face an unreadable mask of legal authority. Gable took up a position by the door, arms crossed. "You're in my chair, Richard," I said, my voice dangerously even. "Security!" Richard screamed, his face turning that familiar mottled purple. "How did this street trash get past the lobby? Remove him immediately!" None of the building security moved. Gable glared at them, and they wisely decided to stare at the floor. "I am the majority shareholder of Pendleton Logistics," I said, continuing my slow walk toward the head of the table. "I own 68% of this company, which means I don't need a board vote to terminate your employment, Uncle Richard." Beatrice stood up, her icy facade cracking. "You little bastard! You know nothing about this business. You will run us into the ground in a week." I reached the head of the table. Richard was shaking with rage but refused to move. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I simply unclasped the leather portfolio Gregory had given me and dropped a thick stack of papers directly onto the glass table in front of Richard. "Cypress," I said quietly, locking eyes with him. All the color violently drained from Richard's face. He stared at the top document, a bank ledger with his forged signature on it. $62 million funneled from the European shipping contracts over the last 4 years. I continued projecting my voice so every board member could hear. Funneled into 3 shell corporations registered under your mistress's maiden name. Grandfather knew Richard. He documented every single stolen cent. The boardroom erupted into frantic whispers. The board members, previously ready to hand Richard the keys to the kingdom, now looked at him like he was infected with the plague. That is fabricated," Richard sputtered, sweat pouring down his forehead. "This is a setup. The FBI's white-collar crime division won't think so." Gregory intervened smoothly, stepping forward. "A copy of this file was sent to the director's office at 9 o'clock this morning. They are currently securing warrants for your offshore accounts." Richard stumbled backward, his knees hitting the presentation whiteboard behind him. I turned my attention to Beatrice. She was clutching her pearl necklace so tightly her knuckles were white. "Aunt Beatrice," I said, sliding a second, thinner folder across the table toward her. "Martha's Vineyard. Summer of 2018. The zoning commissioner who mysteriously dropped his opposition to your luxury development project after a deposit of $500,000 appeared in his daughter's college fund." Beatrice gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of air, and collapsed back into her chair. I looked around the room, meeting the terrified eyes of the Pendleton Board of Directors. I had never run a company, I had never worn a suit before today, but I knew how to survive, and I knew how to dominate a room full of cowards. "My grandfather is dead," I announced, taking the leather chair at the head of the table. "And the era of parasites feeding off his life's work is officially over. If any of you have a problem with my leadership, the door is open. But know this, if you stay, you are loyal to me and me alone. If you cross me, I won't just fire you, I will ruin you." I looked down at Richard, who was practically hyperventilating against the wall. "Get out of my building, Richard, before I have Gable throw you through the window." The aftermath of the boardroom coup was swift and brutal. By noon, the financial news networks were in an absolute frenzy. The chyrons at the bottom of the screens read, "Orphan hire seizes Pendleton Empire, Richard Pendleton ousted." I sat in the back of the Maybach as we headed back to the Greenwich estate, watching the news coverage on the monitor embedded in the seat headrest. They showed grainy aerial footage of St. Jude's Home for Boys, contrasting it with the glittering glass of the Pendleton Logistics Tower. They called me a Cinderella story. They called me a prodigy. They didn't know I was holding my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "They won't go quietly, Oliver," Gregory said, breaking the silence. He was furiously typing on a secure tablet. Richard's legal team is already filing emergency injunctions, claiming you coerced the board. Beatrice is likely leveraging her political contacts to freeze the estate's domestic accounts. Let them, I replied, my eyes fixed on the blurring trees outside the tinted windows. They are fighting a conventional war. Grandfather didn't leave me conventional weapons. When we returned to the manor, I locked myself in Arthur's study. The adrenaline from the morning was fading, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I bypassed the embezzlement files and dug deeper into the encrypted flash drive. There was one folder I hadn't opened yet, buried beneath layers of password protection. It was simply titled Project Icarus. I clicked it open. The screen flooded with complex engineering schematics, patent applications, and heavily redacted emails between my father, David, and Arthur. For the first time in my life, I was looking at my father's actual handwriting in the margins of the blueprints. My chest tightened. The state had told me he was a mid-level manager who fell asleep at the wheel. The truth, staring back at me from the glowing screen, was that David Pendleton was a brilliant mechanical engineer. He had designed a revolutionary hydrogen combustion retrofitting system for commercial freight ships. It was a prototype that could slash international shipping fuel costs by 70% while eliminating carbon emissions. It was the holy grail of modern logistics. It was also a death sentence for the oil conglomerates that Pendleton Logistics partnered with. I found a recorded audio file dated 3 weeks before my parents' death. I clicked play. The speakers crackled, and then a voice I hadn't heard since I was 3 years old filled the room. Dad, you have to listen to me, my father's voice pleaded, tense and breathless. Richard has compromised the prototype. He's been meeting with Simon Caldwell. They're trying to sell the Icarus patents to the Volkov Syndicate to bury the technology. If we take this to market, their oil contracts are worthless. Richard threatened Sarah tonight. We are leaving for the safe house in Vermont. Arthur's voice, rough and heavy with age, replied, David, do not get in that car. Let my security team escort you. The Syndicate has eyes everywhere. I can't trust your security, Dad. I can't trust anyone in the company. We are leaving now. We have Oliver. The recording clicked off. I sat back in the leather chair, the air feeling suddenly too thin to breathe. Richard hadn't just killed them out of jealousy over the inheritance. He killed them for a payout from a Russian energy syndicate. And Beatrice, with her political ties, had ensured the local police wrote it off as a tragic accident on black ice. A sharp rap on the heavy oak door snapped me out of my dark spiral. Thomas Gable stepped in, his face tight, his hand resting instinctively on the holster at his hip. Boss, Gable said, his voice dropping an octave. We have a problem. The perimeter alarms just went offline. A glitch? I asked, standing up. I don't believe in glitches, Gable replied, drawing his weapon. Stay away from the windows, get into the panic room behind the bookshelf. Now, before I could move, the massive bay window of the study shattered inward in a shower of reinforced glass. A heavy, metallic canister bounced onto the Persian rug, hissing violently. Tear gas. Down, Gable roared, tackling me to the floor just as the unmistakable pop, pop, pop of suppressed gunfire tore through the mahogany paneling behind my desk. My orphanage instincts, the ones that told me to drop, cover, and survive, took over. I scrambled behind the heavy oak desk, eyes watering instantly from the acrid white smoke filling the room. Two figures dressed in tactical black breached the shattered window, rappelling down from the roof. This wasn't a warning. This was a professional hit. Gable fired twice, hitting the first intruder center mass. The man dropped. The second intruder rolled, returning fire, pinning Gable behind a marble bust near the door. I was unarmed, terrified, and suffocating in the smoke. But I wasn't helpless. I grabbed the heavy brass puzzle box off the desk. As the second hitman advanced toward Gable's position, completely ignoring the kid cowering behind the desk, I lunged. I didn't think, I just reacted. I swung the solid brass box with every ounce of strength I had built up, hauling coal and fighting for scraps. It connected with the side of the hitman's tactical helmet with a sickening crack. He stumbled, disoriented, and Gable stepped out, neutralizing him with a single, precise shot. The room fell deadly silent, save for the hissing gas canister and the ringing in my ears. Gable kicked the weapons away from the bodies and pulled his radio. Control, this is Gable. Code red in the master study. 2 hostiles down. Secure the perimeter. He turned to me, coughing through the smoke, pulling me up by the collar of my ruined designer suit. Are you hit? No. I choked out, wiping blood from a glass cut on my cheek. I looked down at the bodies. Richard sent them. Gable knelt beside the second man, ripping the tactical mask off his face. These aren't local thugs, Oliver. These are private military. Simon Caldwell's people. The syndicate. Richard had panicked. He knew the embezzlement files I dropped on the boardroom table were just the beginning. He was trying to erase me before I could find the Icarus files. Gable? I said, my voice hardening into something cold and unrecognizable. Even to myself. Get Gregory on the secure line. We aren't playing defense anymore. We are going to burn them to the ground. By 3 a.m., the Greenwich estate was swarming with private security and a discreet cleanup crew Gregory had on retainer. The police were deliberately not called. In Arthur Pendleton's world, involving the authorities before you controlled the narrative was a fatal mistake. I sat at the massive dining room table, a bandage over my cheek, surrounded by Gregory, Gable, and Clara, who was silently pouring black coffee with shaking hands. Richard has crossed the Rubicon, Gregory said, his face pale under the harsh chandelier light. He contacted Simon Caldwell the moment he left the boardroom. They know you have access to Arthur's encrypted files. They are terrified you have the Icarus prototype. Do I? I asked, looking up. The files just show blueprints. Where's the actual engine my father built? Gregory sighed, pulling a heavily worn, leather-bound ledger from his briefcase. Arthur hid it. After your parents were murdered, he knew the prototype was too dangerous to destroy, but too volatile to release. He placed it in a subterranean vault in a shell facility under the name St. Jude Holdings. The name hit me like a physical blow. St. Jude. He had hidden my father's legacy under the same name as the prison he had hidden me in. Where is the facility? Gable asked, leaning over the blueprints. An abandoned shipyard in Brooklyn, I answered softly, putting the pieces together. Arthur owned it. He used to funnel the Anonymous' orphanage donations through a Brooklyn property holding. If we know that, Gregory warned, Richard can figure it out. He has the syndicate's resources. I want him to figure it out, I said, a dangerous plan forming in my mind. I looked at Gable. How many men can you mobilize by tomorrow night? 40. All ex-military, heavily armed, Gable replied without hesitation. But boss, walking into an abandoned shipyard at night against Caldwell's syndicate is suicide. It's not suicide if it's a trap, I said, standing up and pacing the length of the long table. Richard is desperate. He needs the prototype to pay off the syndicate for his failures and to secure his escape. We are going to let it leak that I am moving the Icarus engine from the Brooklyn shipyard to a secure location in Switzerland tomorrow at midnight. He will intercept the transport, Gregory realized, his eyes widening. Exactly. And when he shows up with Caldwell's men, we won't be there with just private security. I looked at the lawyer. Gregory, those FBI contacts you used for the embezzlement files, how much do they want to take down the Volkov syndicate? Gregory smiled, a slow, predatory grin. More than they want their pensions. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in orchestrated deception. We used a known mole in the Pendleton IT department, a mid-level manager. Richard had been bribing for years to accidentally intercept an encrypted email detailing the midnight transport of the Icarus engine. Then, we went to work on Beatrice. Aunt Beatrice was currently hiding in her Manhattan penthouse, desperately trying to unfreeze her assets. I had Gregory send her a very specific courier package. Inside was a copy of the Martha's Vineyard bribery file, along with a simple note, I know about the hit squad. If you don't want to go down as an accessory to my attempted murder, be at the Brooklyn shipyard tonight at 11:30 p.m. We will negotiate your severance. Will she show? Gable asked as we sat in the mobile command center, a blacked-out surveillance van parked 2 blocks from the rusting, decaying Brooklyn shipyard. She's a coward, I said, staring at the thermal imaging monitors showing the dark, rain-slicked docks. Cowards will do anything to save themselves. She'll show up hoping to betray Richard to me for a plea deal. The rain was coming down in sheets, drumming heavily against the roof of the van. Inside, the air was thick with tension. 3 blocks away, 24 FBI tactical units were staging in unmarked box trucks, waiting for my signal. At exactly 11:40 p.m., a sleek, silver town car rolled silently through the rusted chain-link gates of the shipyard. The thermal cameras picked up a single passenger in the back. That's Beatrice, Gable confirmed, adjusting his headset. 10 minutes later, the atmosphere shifted. The hair on my arms stood up. 3 matte black SUVs, headlights killed, slithered onto the docks like snakes. They parked in a tactical formation, blocking the exit. Doors opened in unison, and heavily armed men poured out, moving with terrifying, silent efficiency. In the center of the formation stood two men. One was Simon Caldwell, tall, sharp-featured, wearing a raincoat over a tailored suit. The other was Richard Pendleton. He held a suppressed pistol, looking frantically around the empty loading bay. He saw Beatrice's town car and signaled his men to surround it. "He's taking the bait," I whispered, watching the monitor as Richard's men dragged a screaming Beatrice out of her car and into the freezing rain. "Where is it?" Richard yelled, his voice echoing over our hidden microphones. He pressed the gun to his own sister's head. "Where is the kid, Beatrice? Did he set this up?" "I don't know," she sobbed, sinking to her knees in the mud, her designer clothes ruined. "He told me to come here. He has the bribery files, Richard. It's over." "It's not over until I get that engine," Richard screamed, his composure completely shattered. He looked at Caldwell. "Tear this place apart. Find the vault." "We have him," Gregory said, his hand hovering over the secure radio link to the FBI commander. "We have him on tape, colluding with the syndicate, assaulting his sister, and attempting grand larceny." "Do it," I commanded. Gregory pressed the button. "Director, the package is wrapped. Execute." The docks instantly exploded in blinding, strobing blue and red lights. Sirens shattered the quiet night. The FBI box trucks tore through the perimeter fencing, cutting off the syndicate's escape routes. Dozens of federal agents swarmed the loading bay, assault rifles raised. "FBI, drop your weapons. Drop them now." Caldwell's men were professionals. They knew when they were outgunned. One by one, they dropped their rifles into the mud and raised their hands. Caldwell himself didn't even blink, calmly lighting a cigarette as an agent threw him against the hood of an SUV to cuff him. But Richard completely lost his mind. He didn't drop his gun. He grabbed Beatrice, pulling her up as a human shield, waving his pistol frantically at the advancing wall of federal agents. "Stay back!" Richard shrieked, spit flying from his mouth, his eyes wide and unhinged. "I am a Pendleton! I built this city! You can't touch me!" "Gable," I said, opening the side door of the surveillance van, stepping out into the freezing rain. "Let's go say hello." The rain felt like needles against my face as I stepped out of the mobile command center and into the chaotic, strobing glare of the FBI cruisers. The air smelled of mud, rusted metal, and ozone. "Oliver, stay in the van!" Gregory yelled from behind me, but his voice was drowned out by the heavy drumming of the storm and the shouting of the federal agents. Thomas Gable was immediately at my side, his body positioned between me and the loading bay, his sidearm drawn and leveled perfectly at Richard's chest. I didn't stop walking until I was 20 feet away from my uncle. Richard looked like a drowned rat. His custom suit was soaked and plastered to his shaking frame, his thinning hair plastered to his forehead. He had his arm wrapped tightly around Beatrice's throat, pressing the barrel of his suppressed pistol against her temple. Beatrice was weeping hysterically, her expensive mascara running down her face in thick black rivers. To Richard's left, Simon Caldwell, the head of the Volkov Syndicate's American branch, was already leaning against the hood of an SUV in handcuffs. Caldwell watched me with a terrifyingly calm, calculating gaze. "Call them off, Oliver!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking violently. "Call off the feds and open the vault! I know it's down there! I know the Icarus engine is in this facility!" "You always were the stupidest person in the room, Richard," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the storm. I didn't feel the freezing rain. I didn't feel the fear that had dictated my life for 15 years. I just felt a profound, icy clarity. "Shut up. I will kill her. I will blow her brains out right here." "Do it," I said flatly. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. The FBI agents hesitated, their fingers tightening on their triggers. Beatrice let out a muffled, terrified shriek. Richard blinked, completely thrown off balance by my response. She covered up my parents' murder. I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. She bribed officials, stole from the company, and laughed when she thought I was getting nothing but an orphanage cot for the rest of my life. "You think I care if you shoot her? You think grandfather cared? He left you both the rope, Richard. You're just the one tying the noose." The engine, Richard hyperventilated, the gun shaking wildly against Beatrice's head. "Give me the engine. Caldwell needs it. I need it to buy my life back." Caldwell let out a dry, humorless chuckle from the hood of the SUV. "You have nothing to buy your life back with. Richard, you are a liability." "Shut up, Simon," Richard shrieked. He turned his wild eyes back to me. Where's the vault? There is no vault, Uncle, I said quietly, though the microphones picked it up perfectly. St. Jude Holdings doesn't own a subterranean bunker. It owns a server farm in Silicon Valley. Richard froze. What? I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was illuminated, showing a live countdown timer that had just hit 0. Did you really think my grandfather, a man who built a global empire from scratch, would leave the most revolutionary piece of technology in human history in a rusting Brooklyn shipyard? I asked, shaking my head. The Icarus engine isn't a piece of hardware, Richard. It's a schematic. It's a sequence of patents, mathematical equations, and metallurgical formulas. And my father finished it before you cut his brake lines. No, Richard whispered, the realization draining whatever blood was left in his face. For 15 years, grandfather had a team of rogue engineers secretly finalizing the digital blueprints. I said, my voice rising. And 10 minutes ago, while you were holding a gun to your sister's head in the mud, those files were uploaded to an open source global server. The Icarus retrofitting system is now public domain. Every shipping company, every university, every engineer on the planet has it. It's free. I looked over at Caldwell. The syndicate boss's calm demeanor finally cracked. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He knew exactly what that meant. His monopoly on global oil shipping had just been vaporized in a single keystroke. The billions they had promised Richard to bury the tech were now completely worthless. You didn't just lose the company, Richard, I said, watching my uncle's spirit completely break. You destroyed the syndicate's leverage, and now you have nothing. Richard let out a pathetic, broken sound. His grip on Beatrice loosened. The gun drooped toward the mud. Take him, Gable commanded over the radio. Before Richard could raise the weapon again, 3 FBI tactical agents lunged. They ripped Beatrice away, throwing her to the ground, and tackled Richard hard into the wet pavement. The gun clattered harmlessly away. Richard didn't even fight back. He just laid in the mud, sobbing like a child as the heavy steel cuffs were ratcheted onto his wrists. Beatrice was immediately swarmed by agents, read her rights, and dragged away. She looked back at me once, her icy blue eyes wide with pure, unfiltered terror. I didn't blink. I didn't offer a shred of pity. Well played, kid, Caldwell said as an agent shoved him toward a transport van. He locked eyes with me. But you just made an enemy of a very large, very well-funded syndicate. I am Arthur Pendleton's grandson, I replied coldly. I'm not hiding anymore. If the syndicate wants a war, they know exactly where my tower is. The cleanup took hours. By the time I sat back in the leather seat of the Maybach, the sun was threatening to break over the New York skyline, painting the heavy clouds in shades of bruised purple and dull gold. Gregory sat across from me, looking 10 years older, but breathing easier than he had all week. The board has been notified of the arrests, Gregory said, looking at his tablet. Stock prices will plummet at the opening bell, but when the market realizes you open source the Icarus tech, Pendleton Logistics will be positioned as the primary manufacturer for the retrofitting hardware. You're going to lose millions today, Oliver, but you'll make billions next quarter. I don't care about the money, Gregory, I said, leaning my head against the cold glass. I know, he smiled softly. Arthur knew that too. That's why he trusted you with it. Over the next 6 months, I cleaned house. I fired half the board of directors and replaced them with young, hungry, ethical executives who actually believed in what my father had designed. Pendleton Logistics pivoted away from oil dependencies and became the global leader in green hydrogen shipping. Richard was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole for conspiracy, embezzlement, and the murder of David and Sarah Pendleton. Caldwell's lawyers managed to reduce his sentence, but the syndicate was critically crippled by the release of the Icarus technology. Beatrice struck a plea deal, turning over decades of corporate corruption files to avoid jail time. She was stripped of her trust fund and left completely bankrupt, forced to move into a tiny studio apartment in Queens. The day the first Icarus retrofitted cargo ship launched from the harbor, I didn't attend the press conference. Instead, I drove out to a quiet, rolling green cemetery in upstate New York. I stood before 2 marble headstones. David Pendleton, Sarah Pendleton. I wasn't wearing a grease-stained overall anymore. I was wearing a sharp charcoal suit, flanked by Thomas Gable and a private security detail that hung back respectfully near the tree line. I knelt in the soft grass and placed a single white rose on each grave. We did it, I whispered, the wind carrying the words away. You're safe now. And your work is going to change the world. I stood up, adjusting my coat against the chill. I was 18 years old. I'd spent my childhood in the dark, treated like a ghost by a family of monsters. But they had underestimated the sheer willpower it takes to survive in the shadows. They thought they could break me. Instead, they had forged me. "Ready to go, Mr. Pendleton?" Gable asked, opening the heavy door of the Maybach. I looked back at the graves one last time, a genuine smile touching my face. "Yeah, Thomas," I said, stepping into the car. "Take me home." And that is how a grease-stained orphan from St. Jude's overthrew a corrupt billionaire dynasty to avenge his parents. Oliver's journey from being the forgotten, hidden heir to the mastermind who brought down his evil aunt and uncle proves that sometimes the hardest beginnings forge the sharpest minds. The Pendleton Empire is finally in the right hands, and the world is forever changed by his father's legacy. If this story of betrayal, revenge, and justice keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to smash that like button and share this video with your friends who love an epic real-life drama. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling story times. We want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us, what is the very first thing you would buy if you suddenly inherited a billion-dollar empire? Let's chat in the comments.